tens of thousands of jobs, billions of dollars in production. A city built shift by shift, paycheck by paycheck, across more than a century of unbroken manufacturing. Windsor, Ontario was once called the automotive capital of Canada. Its plants ran around the clock. Its parking lots filled before dawn. Chrysler's name was stamped into the identity of every street, every diner, every family that built its life around the rhythm of the assembly line. Then the shifts got shorter. The gates got quieter. The parking lots emptied and stayed that way. Today, the question isn't why Windsor struggled. Every industrial city struggles. The question is how a city this central, this productive, this deeply woven into the fabric of Canadian manufacturing could be made to disappear. So how does an entire car city slowly go silent? That story begins not with a single decision, but with a century of promises the market eventually stopped keeping. Look at a map, and the logic becomes immediate. Windsor sits at the southern tip of Ontario, separated from Detroit by a river narrow enough to see across. When the American automobile industry rose to dominate the 20th century, Windsor did not have to chase the opportunity. Geography had already placed it at the front of the line. Chrysler established its Canadian operations in Windsor in 1925. The choice was not sentimental. It was strategic. Labor costs ran lower than across the border. The workforce was skilled, disciplined, and hungry for steady work. Rail lines and river crossings made moving parts and finished vehicles across the border a matter of hours, not days. Canadian government incentives sweetened the arrangement further. For Chrysler, Windsor was not a compromise. It was the obvious answer. Through the post-war decades, the plants expanded and the workforce grew with them. At its peak, the Windsor Assembly Complex employed tens of thousands of workers directly, with thousands more feeding into the supply chain that wrapped around it. Entire neighborhoods organized themselves around factory shifts. A man finished his apprenticeship, joined the line, bought a house 3 streets from the plant, and expected his son to do the same. That expectation felt reasonable, because for decades it was. The Canada-United States Automotive Products Agreement of 1965 locked this arrangement into place. The Auto Pact, as it was known, eliminated tariffs on vehicles and parts crossing the border between the two countries. Windsor was no longer simply near Detroit. It was functionally part of the same industrial ecosystem, plugged directly into the most powerful manufacturing network on Earth. Canadian production quotas guaranteed that a meaningful share of every car sold in Canada would be built in Canada. Windsor's position was not just protected, it was enshrined. The city that grew around this arrangement was not modest about what it had built. Windsor carried the title of Automotive Capital of Canada with the confidence of a place that had earned it. Its union halls were full. Its credit unions were flush. Its high schools sent graduates straight onto the assembly line at wages that made a university degree seem like a detour. The plants ran. The river kept its banks. The paychecks arrived every 2 weeks without fail. For a generation, Windsor didn't just build cars, it built lives. The first warning arrived not from a boardroom, but from a gas pump. The oil crisis of the early 1970s sent fuel prices surging across North America and exposed a vulnerability that Detroit, and Windsor with it, had spent decades ignoring. North American automakers had built their dominance on large vehicles with large engines. Now those same vehicles sat on dealer lots, while consumers crossed the street to buy smaller, more efficient Japanese imports. Toyota and Honda didn't need to beat Chrysler on prestige. They only needed to beat it on the cost of filling a tank. Chrysler absorbed the blow worse than its rivals. By 1979, the company was hemorrhaging money at a rate that threatened its survival. Losses reached $1.7 billion in a single year, a figure staggering enough to force the United States government into an intervention. Federal loan guarantees kept Chrysler alive. Lee Iacocca's turnaround became the stuff of business legend. But Windsor felt the shockwave directly. Production cuts meant layoffs. Layoffs meant empty shifts. Empty shifts meant quieter streets and anxious households in neighborhoods that had never planned for this. The recovery came, but the ground beneath it had shifted. Through the 1980s, globalization began rewriting the economics of automobile manufacturing in ways that no trade agreement had anticipated. Japanese and European manufacturers opened plants in the American South, in states with lower wages, weaker unions, and none of the legacy costs that weighed on Windsor's balance sheets. The same car could now be built for less, closer to the American consumer, without crossing a border at all. Automation accelerated the pressure. Robots replaced welders. Computer-controlled systems replaced inspectors. The output per worker climbed steadily, which meant the number of workers required to maintain the same output fell just as steadily. Windsor's headcount began to shrink, not through dramatic announcements, but through retirements not replaced and positions quietly restructured away. Then came NAFTA in 1994. The promise was growth through open markets. The reality, seen from Windsor, was a door opened wide to Mexican production facilities where labor costs ran at a fraction of anything Ontario could offer. The auto-pact protections that had guaranteed Canadian production quotas were eventually ruled offside under new trade rules and dismantled entirely by 2001. The jobs didn't disappear overnight. They drained away, shift by shift, model by model, year by year. In the autumn of 2008, the American financial system collapsed and took the car market down with it. Consumer credit dried up overnight. Showroom traffic fell to levels not seen in decades. Chrysler, already carrying the weight of aging models, high fixed costs, and a product lineup built around trucks and minivans, ran out of runway faster than anyone in Windsor wanted to admit. By April 2009, the company that had anchored this city for more than 80 years filed for bankruptcy protection. The word landed in Windsor like a physical blow. The bailout that followed was the largest automotive rescue in Canadian history. The federal government in Ottawa and the provincial government in Queen's Park committed roughly $4 billion combined, alongside a far larger American intervention. The money came with conditions and with promises. Canadian jobs would be protected. Canadian plants would remain part of the restructured company's future. Windsor's assembly operations, built around the minivan segment that Chrysler had dominated for decades, were held up as proof that the investment made sense. For a moment, it felt like survival. The Windsor assembly plant kept its lines running. Workers who had braced for permanent closure returned to their shifts. Politicians stood in front of cameras and described the bailout as a bridge to a stronger, leaner, more competitive Chrysler. The language was careful and confident. The relief in Windsor was genuine. But the company that emerged from bankruptcy was not the company that had gone in. Fiat, the Italian automaker that took control as part of the restructuring, had its own priorities, its own product strategy, and its own global footprint to manage. Chrysler became Fiat Chrysler Automobiles, a corporation whose center of gravity sat somewhere between Milan and Auburn Hills, not Windsor. The new owners honored the immediate commitments. The longer-term question of where future investment would flow was answered more quietly, over years rather than months. The structural damage ran deeper than any bailout could reach. Pension obligations accumulated over generations. Infrastructure that had not been modernized at the pace the market demanded. A product mix concentrated almost entirely in one segment, in a world where that segment's future was already being questioned. Windsor had been rescued. But rescue and reinvestment are different things. The bailout kept the lights on, but it couldn't change who was now in charge or what they were planning. In January 2021, Fiat Chrysler Automobiles merged with the French-American PSA Group to form Stellantis. The new company controlled 14 brands, manufacturing operations across 3 continents, and a workforce numbered in the hundreds of thousands. It was one of the largest automakers ever assembled under a single corporate roof. Windsor was one plant among dozens. The logic of consolidation is not complicated. When 2 global corporations combine, the first task is to find the overlap and cut it. Factories that produce similar vehicles in similar segments do not both survive the rationalization process. The question asked in every boardroom review is not which plant has the longest history or the most loyal workforce. The question is which plant produces the most output at the lowest cost with the best proximity to its target market. Windsor had to answer that question in competition with facilities in Italy, in Mexico, in Eastern Europe. In markets where labor costs, energy costs, and government incentives created arithmetic that Ontario could not match. The electric vehicle transition made the calculation harder still. Battery-powered vehicles are fundamentally simpler to assemble than combustion engines. Fewer components, fewer moving parts, fewer workers required per unit produced. The shift to electric was not just a change in what cars were made of. It was a restructuring of how many people it took to make them. Stellantis announced significant EV investments through 2023 and 2024. The factories chosen to lead that transition were not in Windsor. In the summer of 2023, Stellantis idled the Windsor assembly plant. Production stopped. Workers were sent home. The company cited market conditions and inventory levels. The language was operational. The effect was devastating. A facility that had survived bankruptcy, foreign takeover, and decades of restructuring sat silent while its workers waited for news that kept changing shape. The political response was immediate and loud. Canadian federal ministers demanded commitments. Ontario's government pressed for a restart timeline. Stellantis responded with language that satisfied no one and obligated nothing. The same taxpayers who had contributed $4 billion to keep Chrysler alive in 2009 were watching the successor company treat Windsor as a variable to be optimized rather than a community to be sustained. The arithmetic was impossible to ignore. Windsor had survived bankruptcy. It could not survive being made irrelevant. The economic data captures part of what happened to Windsor. The human cost does not fit into a spreadsheet. When an industry at this scale contracts, the damage does not stay inside the factory gates. It moves outward in concentric rings, touching everything that was built around the assumption of full employment. The diner that opened at 5 in the morning to feed workers coming off the night shift loses its reason to open early. The tool supplier that ran 3 shifts to service the assembly line cuts back to 1. The credit union that financed a generation of first homes and first cars watches its loan book shrink as the members it was built to serve leave or stop borrowing. Each closure feeds the next. The rings keep expanding. Windsor's population told the story in its own flat numbers. While cities like Toronto, Ottawa, and even Hamilton grew through the 2000s and into the 2010s, Windsor stagnated. Young people who grew up expecting to follow their parents onto the line left instead, drawn toward cities with economies that weren't built around a single employer's quarterly decisions. The ones who stayed had faced a labor market that had not yet found a replacement for what it lost. The generational rupture cut deepest. In a company town at full strength, a trade is something inherited. A father's position on the line, his union seniority, his knowledge of the plant's rhythms and rituals, all of it carried forward. When the line stops, the inheritance disappears. The son has skills calibrated for a world that no longer exists in his city. The daughter who might have entered the supply chain finds the chain itself has been relocated to another country. What replaced the automotive economy in Windsor came in smaller pieces. Warehousing, logistics, some light manufacturing, healthcare and public sector employment. These sectors provided work, but not at the wages, the benefits, or the scale that the assembly plants had sustained for decades. The middle-class architecture that Chrysler had underwritten, the houses, the pensions, the union halls, the sense that steady work was a reasonable expectation for anyone willing to show up, did not transfer cleanly to the economy that replaced it. The plants still standing are quieter than they used to be. The ones that closed are quieter still. It is tempting to look for a single villain in Windsor's story. A reckless executive, a short-sighted government, a trade deal signed in the wrong room by the wrong people. The temptation is understandable, because a single villain can be named, blamed, and dismissed. The truth is less satisfying and more instructive. Windsor fell because of forces that were each, on their own, manageable. Together, arriving in sequence over 5 decades, they were not. Globalization moved production toward the lowest available cost, and Windsor could never win that race. Mexican assembly workers earning a fraction of Ontario wages were not a threat that any union contract or government subsidy could permanently neutralize. The economic gravity of cheap labor pulls in one direction, and it does not reverse because a city has a long history or a loyal workforce. Automation eroded the headcount that remained. Every efficiency gain celebrated in a quarterly earnings call translated directly into fewer positions on the floor. The same number of vehicles built by a smaller number of people in less time. Progress and employment pulled against each other, and progress won every round. Corporate consolidation moved the decision-making further from Windsor with each successive merger. When Chrysler absorbed and was absorbed, when Fiat arrived, when Stellantis assembled itself from a dozen national brands, Windsor's voice in the room grew quieter. Decisions about where to invest, which plants to modernize, which segments to prioritize, were made by people who had never driven down Ouellette Avenue or eaten breakfast in a diner that opened before the morning shift. Government policy created the framework, but could not control what moved through it. Trade agreements designed to expand markets also expanded the geography of competition. Bailout conditions protected immediate employment without mandating long-term reinvestment. The tools available to governments were blunt instruments applied to a problem that required precision. The electric vehicle transition arrived as the final structural argument for doing elsewhere what Windsor had always done here. Fewer parts, fewer workers, new factories with new logic, built in places unburdened by the legacy costs of a century of industrial production. Could different decisions have changed the outcome? Stricter bailout conditions, perhaps. Earlier mandates for domestic EV investment. Trade architecture built to retain production rather than simply enable exchange. Possibly. But no single lever, pulled at any single moment, would have been enough. Windsor didn't fall because of one decision. It fell because 100 decisions made in boardrooms that had stopped thinking of Windsor at all. Windsor is not an exception. It is the pattern. Detroit, Flint, Hamilton, Brantford. The names change, but the shape of the story does not. An industry arrives, builds a city around itself, and then follows the economics somewhere else. What remains is the city, still standing, still searching for a reason that matches the one it was built around. Windsor built the cars. The cars built Windsor. And when the cars stopped coming, something that took a century to construct came apart in a generation. The question is not whether it can happen again. It is where it is happening right now. Share your thoughts below.